There is a story, a true story, about a young priest who was getting ready to do his first wedding ceremony. Since he had never done a wedding before, he went to an older priest and asked to borrow the book that had the marriage service in it. When the younger priest got the book and started to look through it, he found that the older priest had made quite a few notations in pencil in the margins of the pages. The notations were all basically stage directions, because while the book explained what the priest was supposed to say during the service, it wasn't always clear about what the priest was supposed to do. So, for instance, the older priest had written in things like, "Turn to the groom," or "Turn to the bride," or "Take the rings from the best man." The notations also included instructions that the priest was supposed to give to the congregation. Things like, "Please stand," and "Please kneel." And so, when the day came for the priest to perform the wedding, things started out rather well. And things were going rather smoothly until they got to the point of the service right after the marriage vows. The young priest looked in the book, and written there it said, "You may now kiss the bride." Well, the priest stared at that for a few moments and got a confused look on his face. But he figured, who was he to argue with that older priest who had done literally hundreds of weddings over the years? And so the young priest closed the book, lifted the bride's veil, and kissed her. The bride stood there stunned, and the congregation began to laugh, and it was only then the priest realized his mistake and turned to the groom and said, "Oh, I guess you were supposed to do that." I don't think there's any doubt that as far as the people there at that wedding were concerned, that priest didn't do it right. In our reading today from the Old Testament, we find that when it came to the religious leadership that Eli and his two sons were providing to the people of that day, they weren't doing it right. In particular, in the earlier chapters of 1 Samuel, we're told that when people would bring their offerings to the temple to offer to God, Eli's sons would take from those offerings whatever they wanted for themselves. And if the people tried to complain, the sons of Eli basically told them to shut up and that there was nothing they could do about it because they were the priests. And even worse, when women went to the temple to pray, Eli's sons raped the women. As the Bible describes him, Eli, their father, was not an evil man, and he didn't approve of what his sons were doing. But since he had gotten old and blind, he just was not able to control his sons anymore. All he basically was able to do was wag his finger at them and tell them to behave themselves. But the sons just ignored their father and went right on doing what they felt like doing. And so the people of that day began to wonder, is this what our faith, is this what our religion has come to? As the people looked at what Eli and his sons were doing, as they considered the kind of religious leadership they were providing, the people realized that they weren't doing it right. Well, in those days, there was a young boy named Samuel. Shortly after Samuel was born, his parents decided to dedicate his life to God's service. And so the parents took Samuel to the temple and entrusted him to Eli to raise and to train up in the ways of God. And so one night, as Eli was sleeping in his room there at the temple, Samuel was sleeping in another part of the temple, close to where the Ark of the Covenant was, that special golden box that housed the Ten Commandments. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, Samuel heard a voice calling, "Samuel, Samuel." Well, Samuel knew that at that hour of the night, Eli was the only other person in the temple. So he ran to Eli and asked him what he wanted. But Eli said, "Why did you wake me up? I didn't call you. Go back to bed." Well, a second time, Samuel heard his name being called, and he ran back to Eli. And again, Eli said, "What are you doing waking me up like this? I didn't call you. Go back to bed." Well, a third time, Samuel heard that voice calling, "Samuel, Samuel." And once more, Samuel ran over to Eli to see what he wanted. But Samuel said, "Are you out of your mind, boy? Why do you keep waking me up?" But then, as Eli thought about it a little more, he said, "Maybe it's God who's calling you. And so if you hear that voice again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel laid it down again. And as before, he heard that voice calling, "Samuel, Samuel." And doing as Eli had instructed him, he said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And it was God. But what God had to say surprised Samuel. Because God said that God wasn't going to put up with Eli and his sons anymore. He was going to bring them to an end and start something new with Samuel, trusting that Samuel would listen for God's voice and do it right. What about us? When it comes to what the Christian church in the United States is doing today, or when it comes to what we as a congregation are doing, are we doing it right? Are we truly being the followers of Jesus? Are we truly being the church that God wants us to be? For instance, consider this. The fastest growing religious affiliation in our country right now is not Presbyterian or Catholic or Baptist or Methodist. No, the fastest growing religious affiliation in the United States right now is among those who claim to have no